So hello, everyone. If Luke, can you tell me if you can see and hear all right?
Yep, everything looks good on my end.
Good, okay. We're gonna wait a couple minutes longer since it's our first night, and we've got 20-some, 22, 23 students from Madison joining us as well. Seems like people are adding the course today, so we'll see if they got my last email 10 minutes ago to jump on the site with us. Basically, the course is your choice. You can do it synchronously or you can do it asynchronously. So I'll be here every Tuesday night from 5:30 to 7. You can join whenever you want, but don't be panicked about anything. If you want to do it twice, it'll all be in the OneDrive when we're done. And that calls for Tuesday. And then the other half of the class is already in Canvas. So when you go to the Canvas site, which is also going to be trouble for the Madison students because their Canvas is not our Canvas. So I sent them a very arduous secondary course to access as a guest to our Canvas so they can see the films there. So you kind of get live films here that I post online, and then films that have been online for several years now as the support to illustrate the course textbook. So hopefully if you're online now and you've been in the building today or yesterday, you've walked by 295 and picked up your Wrightscape sort of textbook journal. And if you look through that in the pages, you'll find that every page or a couple drawings per page is missing the artwork. There's little kind of tick marks to start you off of where you're going to follow the film and do what I'm going to do tonight. And every night with me on Tuesday, you're going to draw along. So the content, I think, as physiologists are proving out now, is that you're going to learn 4 times as much by drawing along the information as if we just did a PowerPoint. And I think we're all done with PowerPoints anyway. So I realize that you have access to every great image out there on Frank Lloyd Wright. So go find it once we're done with the content here. I'm going to do things with you that you can't find online. And that'll be added to your learning here as you see the sites and then you open up the internet, the power in your pocket there to show you wonderful things on Flickr or Pinterest, wherever you want. So my photographs are no longer really important because people have photographed it much better. So once we get started here, we're going to go through kind of the ritual of starting the class. But the second half, we are going to draw and deal with our first UNESCO site. So we can just hold on here for a minute or two and collect some more people, because studio, I guess, is supposed to end at 5:20, but it's probably closer to 5:30 and people are walking to their apartments, homes, or maybe they're just going to a different place in the building to log on to the class tonight. And I asked you to at least do it tonight, because then you can do this asynchronously and make it comfortable for you. And then you'll always have me by email or setting up a Zoom if you want on the side, or I'll be in the building 2 times a week. And once I get my schedule settled out, I'll tell you when those times are in case you want to stop by 295 and talk about the class. So the way it's set up, and this is always, you never know the interest in Wright these days, because he's a precarious character with a fabulously operatic life. And hopefully those of you I've been emailing ever since January 1st, although the university wouldn't let me auto-populate the email there, so some people haven't been able to get in yet. So you know somebody who's in the class and isn't here tonight, is kind of on the outside looking in, they have to email me, and I have to physically add them to the email chain instead of being auto-populated when they enrolled. That's just a snafu that I started before the campus started, so apparently I blocked them from being auto-enrolled. But it seems like it's working one way or another, because we have 55 people in the class between the 2 universities. So I'm thrilled. That means there's a lot of interest in Wright, and I'm going to prove out why it's worthy of your attention beyond what you know about Wright, because obviously you're here because you are interested already, but I think I can bear witness to much more extraordinary information that most people don't know about Wright. And so we'll try to catalyze that and make sure it's an integral part of your design career moving forward. Okay, so we're about at 5:40 now, so let's just assume we can move ahead. Again, if you want to watch this again, or if you ever jump in late, or you just can't come at the live time here, just go to the OneDrive. I'll set that up with the first recording tonight, and you can see the entire semester then, and then make sure you also draw from those files as well as the ones that are already in Canvas. And if you work at like 2 or 3 of those films, or 20 minutes each per week, you can do them all in a couple weekends, or do them linked in just the whole semester long, and kind of as it's chronological. So as we move through the semester, you can kind of keep up pace there. And I'll show you the product you're going to create at the end of that in terms of how I look at your drawings and how they're evaluated. So let me get to the share screen here and we'll start. So you've downloaded the syllabus, and being students, you probably won't read it. So what I'm going to do is highlight the important parts, and I'll make sure you understand that are in the syllabus, because that's our contract with each other here. So for those who don't know me, new to the school or from Madison, I'm Professor Mark Keene. I am now Emeritus Professor, which means I've retired. And yet the school, because of my director of Frank Leiter Initiative, asked me to keep teaching the Wright seminar, because we have some issues in the state. We have the issues internationally about Taliesin, which I'll go into in detail in the course of the semester, that it's your generation that needs to create an awareness of one of the most spectacular buildings in the state or in the country that nobody goes to. So hopefully you can rectify that yourselves this semester and get out there yourselves, or certainly in the summer, because it needs your attention. We just completed 27 years of doing HABS drawings for it with students like you. It's now being digitally sent to the Library of Congress in Washington. And then Taliesin West has an archive themselves in the desert in Phoenix, Scottsdale actually, and they've got the originals. So we're done with that project there. And once we get to Taliesin in 1911, we're going to start in 1905 today in terms of UNESCO sites. You'll see the student work. So that's key there. That's who I am. I've got a very long directorship with this, dating back to 1994, when Marshall Erdman, who's an engineer in Madison, donated $250,000 for the study of Wright. And he didn't trust Taliesin anymore because they kind of squandered the funds, so he came to the public institution. And I had a Wright background coming from Oak Park, Illinois. So I was given the funds to work with students and teach seminars, studios, and do the HABS drawings on Taliesin. So reach me by email anytime. Don't try to text. Don't try to call me at home. Just email first, and we can set up a Zoom if you like, or we can work things out just by email. A lot of the stuff is just sort of stockpiled syllabus stuff you have to put in here, but I'm gonna get to the critical point in a second now. The assessment is really simple. It's probably better than text, just showing you how the semester will work out. So it's a 3-credit course, and the university consortium in the Midwest mandates that every 3-credit course has to get 9 hours of work out of the student, either face-to-face in class or through homework or through projects. And that allows the 3 credits to be hung on that class. So if I can assume that's the limit, I'm going to keep you to that limit and make sure you don't go beyond that like most of your studios do and kind of have a little bit of abuse in terms of your time. I'll make sure this is more business-like and you can get it done probably under 9 hours per week. So I'm going to talk about certain aspects through the lecture things, but what I'm going to work at in terms of content historically, I'm simply going to use what the world said about Wright in 2019. They finally said that Franklin Wright is important enough as a global entity, and they don't do this for architects at all, very rarely. They said these 8 sites are World Heritage Sites, that the world somehow needs to put this on their bucket list and get to these 8 sites. So why not say, instead of my opinion or a historian's opinion, this is the world's opinion based on UNESCO, the main office is in Paris, but they get together annually and look at world precious entities. And so rather than pick out one Wright site, they deemed all 8. So I figure we should be drawing those for sure, and you'll be drawing more things in the book so that the drawings on Tuesdays will be longer and more like small drawing renderings, whereas the one in the book are more shorter, closer to sketches, maybe 20 minutes each. So that kind of structures the course that way. And then weekly, you can decide whether you want to do this in a block all at once and get it done, or continue just a bit at a time throughout the semester. But don't fall behind, because if you fall behind, it's not going to impact your class project. The more you know about Wright early, and that's why I wanted you to buy the biography and kind of finish it in a couple of weeks if you could, it'll then catalyze how you think about design moving forward. And that's why you took this course. So move ahead on the biography, move ahead the drawings in the book, get ahead in the class. And that way, the last part of the semester is all about your design, which is a way of you telling Wright, I get it. It's sort of your gift back to Frank Lloyd Wright. So the assessment is broken up. It's very based on sort of like the global aspect, because we have varied degrees of students' abilities here. We have non-majors as well on our campus, as well as Madison's campus. We have engineers, we have interior designers, landscape architects. So it really is, you're going to bring each other up in terms of the types of things you're going to study and the housing choices you select. You can run through the honor code, things like that, pitfalls and stuff. The thing I want to get to are the key aspects of the course, which are in the book, are the draw along lectures, and the number by them is how long it's going to take you. So you can budget your time saying, well, I've got an hour and a half tonight, I can get through 4, something like that. So you decide ahead of time how much you want to do per night, and then look for the spot in the textbook where you have to draw that directly on the correct page associated with the text next to the image. The readings are the book you're going to pick up at $2.95 are the ones I shipped to Madison in case there's Madison students online tonight. You go to the front office in the engineering building. I think I sent you the room number. I forget the woman's name was at the desk. She might not be here all the time, but they know you're coming to pick up your book. UWM students have already prepaid for this through tuition. Madison students owe UWM for the printing cost of the book $30. And I'll send an email out tomorrow about how to get that $30 to me so I can put it back in the right account so we can do more things for students in the future. So the only really textbook beyond what I've written for you, because I've sort of distilled what I think are key things students need to know as designers, because I'm not going to treat you as art historians. I'm going to treat you as people who need to actively learn about principles of design and employ them in your own practice in the future, is that these are 3 really great biographies. And they're kind of the ones that aren't really salacious. They're not telling the story of Wright's life, the background, the things where he got in trouble, the things he did completely sort of denying what he should have at the time, just problematic things that are also in there. Also, the glories of Wright can be really sort of amplified beyond the reality of it. These 3 are very far, very biographic in the sense of a really good standard where you're going to learn things without too much of a slant. Wright has probably more things written on him than anybody in contemporary history. A lot of people who've been dead for ages have a lot of these written on them now for thousands of years, whatever. But Wright, being a 19th and 20th century person, really has issues with so many people write about them. We have to kind of like carve out the ones that are more successful than others. And so I think if you pick from these three, you'll have a better chance of getting more of a sort of a medium type of view. So pick Gill, Seacrest, Twomley, get it from the library, get a used copy, whatever, but get it and read one of those quickly. You don't have to read all three, just one of the three is fine because they overlap. Some are a little more novelized, if you will, and some are more very factual, and probably Twomley is the most staid of the three. So pick those, just get them done. As soon as you can, take them and make sure that's job one, because then it sets up everything else I talk about, everything you draw about. Because if we start drawing about something 2 months from now, and you haven't read about it yet, there's no point in going further. You have to finish that biography first. Now, what's also important with this, I want to show you a little map here, is, and I'll zoom in just a hair. I think I'll zoom in. Yep, this is us, right? State of Wisconsin, southeast. What my wife and I, who's also an architect and teach at Art Institute, in our retirement, we both retired in August. One of our goals is in the salvaging of the future of Taliesin, we're going to work what we perceive as the design arc. And so it's kind of a boomerang shape that if you kind of look at Chicago on the south side, one of these UNESCO sites is the Roby House, which we'll draw a week from today. And then 3 weeks from today, 2 weeks from today, we'll draw Taliesin, and that's also UNESCO. And there's 2 more on the way there, Unity and Jacobs. Along that is Johnson Wax, which should have been one of the top 3, but they declined the offer to become a UNESCO site because they're a private manufacturing plant administration building. They didn't want that kind of celebrity of having too many people coming to tour there. So they said, thank you, but no. But they definitely should have been in the top 8. Jacobs 1 is probably less than 1,200 square feet of design of a single family residence. And the world wants people to come and see this. That's incredible to show that he thought that at Jacobs 1, outside of maybe the Seth Peterson cottage, is the most design he did per square foot in his career. And it's a spectacle because that in a sense is the starting point of the mid-century modern home right there in Madison. And again, nobody really knows about that because it's a private residence, and obviously the owners probably refer it that way. But that's the claim to fame for Madison in terms of Wright. Then you got Taliesin, a 45-minute ride from Madison out to the east. And with that then, on that arc of the highway moving out that way, you've got Milwaukee and its design culture. You've got UWM and its design culture, Johnson Wax coming down to Kenosha and down to Illinois, and finding the glory of Wright's home and studio in Oak Park, Illinois. And so if we could simply develop that as a cultural icon and make sure that most students and the people who want to retire into traveling understand it's not individual buildings, it's this culture of this great design arc across these 2 states. So with that being said, I would imagine between UWM students and UW students, I think the bulk of you might actually live near these places. And so you need to then visit 2 of these sites in the course of the spring semester. So what I've given you in your syllabus here are the sites that are open to the public. And then I highlighted the ones I think, if you have a choice, go to the highlighted ones because they're more of a spectacle, they have more promise. Each one's going to be different in terms of its access points. But I think if you work with one of your peers from this class, one of your peers from UWM or UW College of Engineering, whatever it is, I'll bet most of your peers haven't been to these Wright buildings. So it's like a Saturday or a Sunday, you can knock this off 2 in 1 day. And that way you'll have the presence to say, if I were a world traveler, I'm going to make my way to Southeast Wisconsin and Northeast Chicago of Illinois to see these wonderful UNESCO sites. We live in this area and we don't go see them. So I'm going to make that a mandate as part of your final essay and the final exam that we give at the end of the semester, that you speak to me about the sites you visited in terms of the language of the art and architecture you saw right along the way, and then how it impacted you in a different way by actually being on the sites of these buildings. So plan ahead. Don't wait till April to do this when the weather's nice. Plan ahead for that April visit or that March visit over spring break. Take your family there. Whatever it takes, you have to get to 2 of these sites. So that's about a page and a half there of all these. Each one's probably has its own website now. You can go to a master site of all tourism sites that talk about when things are open and do it that way. But basically, think about this week. Talk to your peers in the class. Talk to your friends who don't know about architecture. Talk to your mom and dad. Bring them along with you because everybody needs to go inside these buildings. And then finally, what I'm trying to coalesce to is who the students are in the seminar. And so I asked in the email, and some of them architecture majors didn't ferret out that's not for them, because I know their background, and because I've got that on the register here, and I know that you're an architecture major. So that was less important for me. It's the Madison students. I don't know what your background was that brought you to a Wright seminar. And so I'd like to hear that about you. Like, some aren't even engineers, they're in interior design or planning, or maybe they're not. And so you need to tell me your current track in college, and then why in the world would you take a Wright seminar all of a sudden, your junior or senior year? So let me know about that, and that'll help me structure more in terms of my reaction to your work as you build that along, what your history is. Although, here's a point in reference about that, about being a Madison student. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Richland Center in 1867. I think I made mention of that in your email earlier. And does well as a student. We'll talk about that, how he did so well as a student later on, because his mother was sort of very controlling about how Frank was perceived as a child. And eventually gets into college engineering at Madison. And he fails in his second semester and never returns to college, and then becomes one of the 4 modern masters of architecture of the 20th century. We're going to talk about how that can possibly happen, to go from Richland Center in South Central Wisconsin, not complete college, and then complete the most distinguished American architectural career, where he's the only architect that's been on Time magazine more than once. He's the only architect that's brought up to the level of Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, and Le Corbusier at an international level. The other 3 went to colleges. The other 3 worked through sort of the language of the modern movement and the connections. Wright did his work almost singleness with a lone quality, a lone wolf in the suburbs of Chicago, until he reached the acclaim in 1909 and had his first international book published on his work. So that's the story we want to kind of bring out and tease as you work through this and kind of move through this process. So what I'd like you to do now, we're not going to draw now, we're just going to write and sketch. So you get a blank piece of paper. We're going to work on kind of the structure for the class in terms of how you work it into what you know about social histories and the language of the 19th and 20th centuries. So I'm going to use just some grid paper here, so my printing stays kind of normative as we kind of just structure this for you. And then hopefully this will help you give a spine in terms of the who and where in the biographies you're reading. And then the chronological chapters in the textbook journal will help kind of sink into this too. But I think if you kind of draw through with me now, you'll see some of these poems you already know about. You'll see how Wright fits in here. Because one of the most extraordinary things about his life is just on the level of being a human being. He lived for 91 years. And just before his 92nd birthday, he passed, and he was still a prolific practicing architect in his 91st year. And the myth is he had 116 projects going on at the time in his firm, which I think has been disputed, because that's even hard for somebody who's in their 20s and 30s or 40s. But the idea is, think about your parents and grandparents and what their busy life is like in their retirement, or what their life is like just sort of hanging on. Wright was a defiant master, rising from the dead over and over again in his career. When people thought he was just consumed by his private life, he kept having these renaissance along the path. So let's draw that path here by starting with the Civil War. So here's the timeline that's going to march us through the 19th century. And the Civil War is 1865. And Wright is born in 67. FLW. Now, to bear out that he was sort of iconically connected to the Civil War, like many children at the time, we know him as Frank Lloyd Wright. His initial birth name was Frank Lincoln Wright, like probably half the country was. And eventually his family went back to the family name on his mother's side, the Lloyd Joneses, and it was named after a relative, and they changed his name back to Frank Lloyd Wright. In this time period, from your early art classes, we're really at the end of the 19th century of the eclectic classical language. So for instance, when Wright hit Chicago, they were having an international fair called the Columbian Exposition to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering America, which is all based on the classical language. And I'll show you the image of that later when we start to draw the Unity Temple. In 1871, what marks Wright as a youth now, a very important part, is Chicago had its massive fire. Which was a devastating point to it. And for those of you from Chicago, you probably know that there are 4 blue lines across the flag horizontally. And 2 are epic events that are positive, and 2 are very negative things. One of those negative things is the Chicago fire. The other is the attack at Fort Dearborn. And the 2 celebrated ones are the fair of 1893 and the fair of 1933. So the fire is represented on the flag to this day, and that gives a land of opportunity for young architects. So when Wright fails out of college, his first piece is, this is unusual because usually things don't happen of this kind of import at the change of a century. But between 1899 and 1900, the change of the entire century, Wright establishes the first prairie house. Not that he called it that, but the historians then reflected back on this period as his prairie period because he was building hypothetically in the prairie, but in fact, it's Oak Park, it's a forest, and adjacent to that, the other homes were in River Forest, which is actually called a forest. So it wasn't as if he could see the horizon because it really was a canyon of oak trees all around him, but it was putting the idea that it wasn't a mountainous terrain. So if you did come to the edge of the lake or found a place where there's open farmland, you did have the extension of an enormous horizontal because there wasn't any high ridges or mounds, so to speak, in that part of the country. So at that point, the prairie starts, and right in the middle of that first decade up to 1910, we're going to stop later on and talk about the first piece of UNESCO World Heritage Site that's Wright responsible for. So even though in round 2, when we do this a week from now, we'll talk about his most favored international prairie home that ends the decade. In the middle of the decade, he does Unity Temple, and that's where we're going to draw the latter part of today. So that decade takes us from 1900 to 1910, and things will shift and change there fairly quickly because, again, we're on the cusp of a decade change. It's 1909. Wright falls in love with a client's wife. And even though by then he had raised 6 children in Oak Park with his first wife and appeared in the Christian center of Oak Park on the first suburb outside of Chicago as a happy Christian family, Wright realized, and some other people have written about from the letters passed between Nahum Cheney and Frank Lloyd Wright, they had found his match, his intellectual equal, which was different than what his wife had offered him. And she coaxed the idea that he needed to have more, for what he completed so far in that first decade, he had to have more exposure on a broader stage to really reach his goals in terms of what the magnitude of his powers of design were. And so he took that road to leave his family behind. And in 1909, he left Europe. And at Europe, he then spent several years writing a book with a German publisher, which is a very remarkable piece of iconic modern language. It's called the Wasmuth Portfolio. So he's in Europe at various studio areas as he travels around, and he's doing renderings, final renderings of like an architect thinking back on his first 10 years, where he did these series of prairie homes, which are going to shock the world, but nobody outside the prairie really knows about them yet. So this will be the piece that, obviously pre-internet and things, is the catalyst that's going to moving ahead. So the Wasmuth Portfolio that is written, and Wright comes back about 1911, soon after this decade change, and then builds the second home for himself as he leaves Oak Park, because he's an adulterer and he's leaving with an adulteress, and they're going to build their fortified, safe place out in the rural plains and the rural rolling mountains of the driftless area outside Madison, out at Taliesin and Spring Green. And that's done between 1911 and 1914. That phase ends by something that happens in the course of Western global ideas with World War I. And so the work diminishes, the direction of architects falls off, and there's less progress. Wright is also ensconced in social turmoil. And so some of the clients, which are more Christian-based, are not giving work to him. And so he has to redesign and reprofile his life. So in a sense, a lot of people, in terms of a career for an architect, would say, yes, this is a heroic piece of architectural history and belongs in the textbooks. And it is associated then with the Art Nouveau, the early prairie, in terms of how it's written about. The thing is, though, and this is the remarkable about Wright's life, is that the prairie is going in both directions. It's being associated with the decorative arts and the idea of the Art Nouveau that had lots of people in the Western Hemisphere, Louis Sullivan in Chicago, Henry Vandevelde, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, Antonio Gaudí. Lots of people were working in this vein of a sort of a different way of looking at architecture in terms of its historical relationship, using more floral patterns and things that are more natural, but not really talking about what's going to come, because it's not even spoken about until people write about the word about change here, pre-war and then with the war. It magnifies the idea that things can change rapidly. And so it gives basis to what happens across post-World War I. And that's the dawn of what we now know historically as the modern movement. And so Wright is considered one of the four main modernists, with Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus. They're associating Wright with that because of his portfolio that started to educate the young architects of the European so-called modern movement. So here's the thing historically that is the spectacle about Wright's ability. In fact, he was doing modern architecture, the language of it, 15 years before they even had a movement called the modern movement. And that's in a flyover state in the center of our country, away from all the architecture programs on the East Coast, from a boy that was raised in Richland Center, Wisconsin. So there's some kind of magic going on here that we need to interpret and apply and share, because it's vital to understanding the idea of how Wright impacted the modern movement, as the other three I mentioned are actually about a half a generation to a generation younger than Wright. So when they start to celebrate what they've achieved, they assume Wright's long gone and that was the end of his career. And yet Wright comes back out of the doldrums leading up to the 1920s and starts to rebound until a second event happens, which also slows down his career. And that social thing happens in 1929. And that's the Great Depression. So nobody has work. And so at that point, Wright entertains projects leading up to here in California, in Japan. He's looking for new ways to kind of resurrect his career. But if you do the math, he's approaching middle life, if not beyond, for the life of an American, and an American architect really don't have that kind of a longevity unless you're coming from the culture of the bequeath status of an East Coast architect that can maintain that through some source of academia. They might be a professor as well as an architect, so the name has more stature. Wright at this point isn't teaching architecture, he's just practicing. So 1929 comes, and his third wife, there's a second one in there, it's a minor story, but his third wife is the one he marries in the 30s. And she has as much impact on Wright as his first wife, Mema, obviously for the children at hand, and then his mother, Anna, who put him on this path that you'll read about in the biographies. And the idea of how you get a storied version of Wright because of the female support of nurture and bringing him along and connecting him into things. And Olga Vanna is rapid change in terms of how she sees the future of Wright's career as well as her career at Taliesin. So 1929, moving then towards the 30s and 40s, they also have a secondary camp in the West because of Wright's bronchitis. A lot of times Midwesterners will end up in the dry desert to help their breathing patterns in the winter months where it's damp and cold, and then return to Taliesin East in probably early spring as soon as the flowers come out, and stay till the cold hits late October. And that was the pattern of moving between Taliesin East and West over the course of decades. So in this time period then, he's reborn with some of his giant work and the stuff that gives him a second boost international acclaim. And I mentioned Jacobs 1 before, about 1936, but at the same time, more spectacular, probably equal to only the Roby House is Falling Water. Yet another one of his myriad UNESCO projects. The same time, within the same decade, years apart, is Johnson Wax, but again, they decide to privatize their area and not have part of that commission that tried to submit the projects to the UNESCO site. Then towards the 50s, now he's in his 80s, pushing through here. Post-World War II, which happens in this block here, in the 40s. The work slows down, but Wright's working more internationally on projects with people that aren't involved in things. Wright works in New York and starts work on the Guggenheim, which gets finished in 1963 posthumously. But there's even points here that Wright's camp that he set up at Taliesin, East and West, was linked to the communist scare that Americans had purported by a Wisconsin senator that tried to chase down people that thought more liberally with ideas that weren't in the conservative nature. And so Wright was associated with that and kind of put a little damper and diminish on his work at that point. And then we find that in 1959, in that summer, he finally passed after doing over 1,200 projects and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of built projects, which now probably 450 still exist. The Conservancy's out there trying to really make sure that things that might be in decline have some support, even to the point where some homes are being moved to better sites and better parts of cities, just to make sure there's an appropriate owner for things. And so that leaves us with then the aspect of what Wright has meant to others, and that's what's in the book towards the end when we start to draw that, and you'll see not only who worked for Wright in his studios, whether it's here or at Taliesin proper in Spring Green or in Taliesin West, who are those names, but then who did he affect who were outside looking in at his career? And how does that idea of organic architecture still hold true today? And that's sort of the path we'll talk about as we move through the book. So that's kind of the timeline that'll take us to where we are now and see what the language of Wright is here. Getting back to this little diagram, that's the part that we're concerned about now as architects in the Midwest, even international architects are concerned about, as these four here seem to be stable because Jacobs is connected to the campus, and that's a retired art history faculty member who brought that back to life. Johnson Wax obviously is in place. The Roby House has been restored nightly. They've restored the Unity Temple. It's Taliesin now, which is the grand idea, because most of these projects emanate outside of the two early ones came from Taliesin. Falling Water, all of his major things from 1911 on came from Taliesin. So not only is it a great home, it's also his think tank. It's his laboratory of ideas. And so that's where this whole push toward the design arc and what you could do in your careers could make sure that's an integral part of the future of thinking about design in the Midwest. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the semester-long project, because it's going to be a shift from past seminars. And so I will pull out another sheet and try to again diagram where I want you to head in terms of your imagination of how you'd like to shape your project. Because I think that when you select Wright in a seminar, there's something that you already know about his architecture, and it probably is predicated on the idea that his number one building type was a single family residence. So if you strip away the glories he has of non-residential architecture, whether it's ecclesiastical work or whether it's office work, there's some magnificent titled buildings, and 3 of them are part of the 8 that are UNESCO sites. And so we'll draw 3 of those non-residential. But the bulk of those projects, those 1,000+ projects Wright did, were residences. And they really fall into 2 broad camps of ideas. And that's where I'd like you to first make your first choice. So we'll draw this in terms of what your project will be. So you're going to work in the realm of Wright by working on a residence. And then from that residence is going to be sort of a bifurcation of choices you can move to. You could move to the earlier period and work with the prairie, or to the later period and work with Usonia. And so the essence here, why they split, is the middle of our last diagram of the Depression. So his prairie clients from the 1880s, when he started his firm in Oak Park, all the way through 1909, where he left for Europe, that prairie sort of school of architecture are more often than not sort of they're a systematic idea, but they're really for the upper class or even beyond the upper class. Some are incredibly magnets of industry that actually hired Wright to do these palaces for him in the prairie style. So he's doing like really great one-of-a-kinds that are part of a family of ideas, like all of his ideas are, because they're all going to come from nature. And we'll talk about that ad nauseum the whole semester. At this point, though, when he's trying to revive his career, and all architects are as well, and the idea that the middle class is rising in America, now everybody gets a chance to do a single family residence. How do you take the prairie, strip it down so it becomes Usonia? What are the principles that he takes with him to Usonia, which stands for the United States of North America, kind of turned into a noun instead of an acronym, as a typology of American homestead? Not only like he talked about the prairie at all, there's still systematically modern ideas, but this is driving the cost down. So he could do, in terms of evaluation over decades now, from 1905 to 2023, he was doing multi-million-dollar homes for the wealthy. Here he has to do a $200,000 home for the middle class or lower middle class, maybe $250,000. They had more money. They came to him for the image of it, and they beefed him up and ended up being maybe a $500,000 home. But there are no really multi-million-dollar homes scaled, and again, going back in time, in the early Usonia days. Maybe as they got more people attracted to them, they became bigger and bolder, they're finished different, but this is a different audience. So I want you to think about which path you'd like to take and work within that design language. That's your first choice there. So that's job 1. Because I'm assuming that's why we're all here. We want to design a home. And it's not something you can't do because it'll take you less time than a third of this class to do this. And I'll show you all the principles and pathways you do to make it seem like drawing a home is actually an easy thing to do. And I'll show you how you're paid for it professionally, so you can run a career doing residential architecture and make money as well. So the second step you have to choose is your site. And obviously for many of you, this will be fiction. You'll find a piece of land, you'll search on Google Maps, you'll search in your neighborhood, you'll search on family property you might own, friends of the family, something up north. It could be a cabin-sized place. It could be something opulent. You can design a palace. You're going to have a real client or a fictional client. You decide that too. Or you could be your own client. So those are the three things that I want you to, as you read the biography, as you draw in this class, as you think about the ideas of Wright, his ideas that he's trying to purport, or the better way to approach design, are only going to be shown that you understand that by designing something with that language. And so your pathways ought to be very controlled here, because I could see among our 55 students, there might be enough to shake it out so we have an even number on both sides, and then that group is going to self-critique each other, and this group will self-critique each other. So we split off. Then you might even have subsets within that to get you to dial in with 4 or 5 people that are doing something very like your scheme, because maybe the sites will be different. Because you could obviously pick a flat site, you could pick something that's on a mountain, or you could pick something that's on a slope. Near water, not near water, in a forest, treed, whatever, the site is actually going to dictate both of these, because Wright, as we'll learn about, is learning everything from nature. To a point where he became kind of, not flippant, but saying that he wasn't a designer. He simply uncovered nature and read the rule book. So we'll talk about that rule book and see how you can actually solve issues, not by drawing where you think the shape is done, but looking at math and geometry and see where Mother Nature said it has to be done this way. And that's as simple as most architects follow this base path. And for those of you from 100 a couple of years ago, we'll do it one more time. If you simply just raise up your index finger really quick on your offhand. And you have in that index finger, you've got 3 knuckles. And one that's at the hand itself. And there's a distance between the tip of your finger to that first knuckle, and a distance between the next 2 and a distance here. That's a higher order of gifting to human nature, that those numbers make sense in math and geometry at the same time. So now I'll go back to that class you had in algebra, and they mentioned the Pythagorean theorem. That's a relationship of how our body grows parts and systemizes how we work. It's not just your finger, it's from your shoulder down to your wrist, it's from your hip down to your ankle. It's in your face, it's in the sculpture of the body, different parts of the body, subatomic relationships. It's everywhere. It's in plants, it's in animals, it's in seashells, it's in patterns of growth. And so that's a system that Wright said, well, that certainly takes the heat off of me as a designer. I'm just going to follow the code there. So when I want to do something rectangular, I'm not just going to assume I can do a pure box that makes sense. So draw that box and figure out what type of rectangle would make that rectangle absolutely beautiful. The way to find that is to bisect that box, find the middle point, and now assume at the bottom here, this piece is now going to move on an axis there. So once you split that, now you've got the radius of a circle. Drop that radius down inside a circle that would go around and integrate 4 squares. And when it touches this bottom line, you created the golden section. So that is 1 to 1.618 with repeating decimals. And so once you layer this information that Wright pulls out, other architects, Wright didn't invent this idea or try to discover it. He just fell in line with hundreds and hundreds of others throughout the history of global culture, looking at nature around them and seeing that's in a sense, the gods, whether it's a singular god or the gods plural, have given us signs about design. We don't have to craft something new here. We simply work with that language to create a higher order design principles there. So this relates then to the Fibonacci series, where if this is a rectangle, then there's a larger square that begets that. Now that's the Fibonacci rectangle, and there's a larger square that comes off of that. And so the whole thing can grow, and as it grows, it wraps around and eventually creates the spiral in nature. And so the things like that then, the fuel, the prairie, the Usonian, so when you walk into a room, there's something inherently correct about it that has a beauty to it beyond right. It's because that's how we activate. That's how our mind and imagination, that's how we hear music. That's how we see space. When you walk into a parking garage and it's long and low and pressing on you, that's a very bad rectangle. It's disproportionate. So as a baby winces at bad music, we wince at bad space, unknowing there's a principle behind it and why it's bad. So Wright rectifies that. So when you walk into his spaces, it's almost like he has a cheating principle. He's going to use nature to make sure he defines the absolute dimension in terms of the scale of the space. He didn't invent that. He just picked it up from history and found that solution. So you'll be employing that once you do this. Once you tell me your site, who your client is, you write a bit of a program. And the program is, a real standard issue one is 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,800 square feet. Something like that is the basis for it. Then you'll elaborate and talk more about the specifics, and obviously then your site will control the massing once you read about Wright. Because his ideas then are one set of ideas here, which are then remasters for the modern movement, so to speak. Those ideas are sort of like a cookbook. When you put them on a site, the site that impacts the forming, so that buildings all share. Here are 2 prairie homes in plan type. They're both prairie homes. They both have the same type of root pitches and stuff, but they have different clients and different sites and different scales. So they're part of a family of ideas. The same will be true for all the Usonian homes from the 30s on, without the pitched roof, without the basement, with cheaper materials and more of a manufactured tool type of detailing system. So as you discover in the book, on your research, as you move about, as you travel to sites, you'll be drawn by one or the other. And you'll tell me in a couple of weeks which path you're going on, and then I'll have you do some presentation work for ideas. We'll draw some in class together as prototypes so you see what we're looking for. And all we're looking for in terms of the semester, it's not working drawings, it's not going to be Revit. For those non-architects in the class here, there are 5 stages to doing, let's say, a residence here. So the first one is schematic design. And that's what we do in most studios and most collegiate things. We just talk about the design of it in its sort of infancy. And rarely is it ever articulated. Sometimes maybe in a senior level studio, sometimes in a graduate, you can get to design development and kind of complete all the design. But sometimes projects stop even at this point because it might be bid out kind of prematurely and say, well, we're way over budget and we can't continue when the client walks away. If you do a good job, you take it to a point where you're moving towards the CDs, which are the blueprints. So the architect is doing 3 big phases here before anything breaks ground. It's all drawings and ideas about what everything's going to cost, what everything design decisions between the architect and the owner is going to do. And then you bid and negotiate with a third party, the contractor, and then you contract administrate, which means you build it. So if all phases work out, you have yourself a home for the prairie of the Usonian. This class is just going to have you work through this. And that's what you'll see in most of Wright's books on design. They're not going to show you the CD set. They're going to show you the infancy of it. And we see a year around a building. When I say 1905 Unity Temple, typically that's the year that Wright designed it and presented to a client as the design's complete. Because it might take 3 years to build it. And sometimes architectural histories will say, well, 1908 is the actual year because that's when the keys were handed over and the village said you could have occupancy. But I prefer the one where it's actually a design idea, because that's where we're learning about the principles for Wright. So that's your project. What we're going to do is work through it on a bi-weekly thing. So every second week, something's going to be due from you. A couple of weeks from now, it'll just be the idea of what you want to do. Tell me your pick here. Tell me about your site. Tell me about your client, your program. So it's just sort of a discussion you've had with other people. Then you're done. 2 weeks later, you're going to draw more. So basically, we're going to, after a certain time, give you a score for 10% of how your progress is. We're going to check back again about midterm, check on that and see how you've realized that in terms of now it's time for substantial feedback. And then when you're done, you submit this the semester, it's reviewed for its entirety, the process as well as what your final project looks like. And that's a chunk of your semester in terms of your points towards the final grade. Okay, so now you've got enough time now to embark on the kind of main course, which is always to draw within Wright's realm here. And so for those of you who managed to either print these out from the online file I sent out, you want to look down on lower right and find unit for Unity Temple and follow with me on the architecture of this in the media of choice, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's choice. And you can do it in regular pencil now, or you can do it any media you want, but I'd like you to drift toward what Wright did in terms of working through all of his architecture, and he worked with Prismacolor pencils. By and large, all of his renderings and design things, that was his drafting tool of choice until it came for his staff themselves to do the drafting. Then they go to harder leads. So I think for the bulk of the semester, because we'll have probably an hour each Tuesday to draw something, we'll stick just with black. But you need a whole array of them, like 5 or 6, so they're all sharpened instead of having to stop and sharpen during the sketch, just so you can go for the whole duration of the sketch and have it complete within that time frame. If it gets advanced for you and too fast, you've got that file you can go back to, reprint this, and start again, and collect the ideas there. And by your second or third, you'll be able to keep up probably stroke by stroke with this as we go through it. Now I will kind of move toward maybe at the end just to do something more of a spectacle when Wright would actually render full in color. At that point, maybe you already own these, but you probably just want to move into the 4 zones of the natural world with pencil. And rather than me be descriptive and say, oh, buy just this one pencil, what you need to have in your arsenal as an architect or designer, you're going to have to buy these anyway, or maybe you can borrow for a friend, is you need a series of greens, a series of warm tones, like earthen tones of browns and yellows, the blues and the reds. And that stays you away from the purples and the pinks and the rest of Prismacolor offers. So the architectural set is actually fairly balanced. So if you bought 4 or 5 of those, 4 or 5 of those, 4 or 5 of those, and 4 or 5 of those, spend money on a little 20 of them, buy them singly, because you buy a set, you're not going to like the colors. Half of them you'll never use, because the sets for colored media are really meant for designers and graphic design, not so much architects. And architecture is very earthen tone, by and large, certainly Frank Lloyd Wright's. So at that point, see what you can, we'll cobble together. I'll tell you what I'm using when I'm doing the color renderings, but up until then, the first half will probably stay in black and white. Okay, before we jump into this, I think we need either a starter course or a refresher course on perspective. So you can determine what you want to call that. All I'm going to do is grab a piece that doesn't have tick marks on it and flip it over and now talk about the 3 fundamentals to perspective. So this is just a quick warm-up sketch or review for most of the students, and it might be a little quick and shocking for others, but I've boiled down the principles of what we're going to do, because architecture by and large is orthogonal. So it's very cubic and easy to draw, because all we have to do is work with the 3 principles. And our first, number 1, is the horizon line. Right? So all we do is pick something in the middle of your sketch paper there and draw this across and do a horizon line. And so that can be found as you walk out of a building, or walk to the top of a building, or walk beneath the height of a mountain, or go beneath your skin and look up. The horizon line is where your eyes are. It's not where you're looking. And that's where some students will fall into that trap in the beginning. So To make it really simple now, the easiest way to find that horizon line is walk to the edge of a field or walk to the edge of a beach and see Lake Michigan. But basically, let's say this is the horizon line out there by that beach, and there's somebody way out there by the edge of the beach, and their eyes and their head are on that, and then they have their torso and their legs that come down. And so now all of a sudden on this little piece of paper, which is, a fraction of a millimeter thick, we've created depth. Because we know that's a human size that gives scale to it, and there's a distance between that person and that line. So that's kind of the magic of perspective, is that once you use the component parts to it, you're going to build the three-dimensional quality onto that illusionary idea of being on a two-dimensional plane. So number 2 then is to have vanishing points. So an idea of vanishing points here is that what if we had another person that was much closer to us in the foreground? Their eyes, if this is flat, are still going to meet. So they're going to have a larger head on there, but they're still connected by their eye height. And then the torso is much larger, closer to us, and the legs come down and step like that. So what happens then is that because they are of the same proportional animated character, we could assume then that if you link a line between their feet and take it back toward this point, then we take the top one back, you can see the tops and bottoms of their forms are finding a vanishing point on the horizon line. And that's the principle we're looking for in terms of building a shape three-dimensionally here. So for instance, the scale of where their hands are drooped at the side of their bodies, here and here, that's another line which is actually parallel to, and yet the parallel lines meet and come back and vanish at that point as well. So now we're going to come back to the cube really quick. And what we want to do here is kind of make a kind of a 2-story cubic volume above the person. So it's got some residential scale for us. And so we'll put, let's say, about 6 or 8 feet of the house beneath the horizon line and then 1.5 stories above it. So that 1 story is here and 2 stories there. And now we're going to change the vanishing point for the sake of the cube, because this is where there's a bit of a brain twist. You were told ever since 3rd grade that parallel lines cannot meet. That's the definition of parallel. And yet in the scientific and artful idea of perspective, these 2 lines are going to meet and vanish in space because that's how the human eye sees them. They're going to come down and meet at a point way back in the page. These 2 are going to vanish to a point over here. So for the sake of making this side on the right more dominant, we're going to put the left point closer, and the right point almost off the page. And I think I teach early on when people are trying to do that, don't try to like write at home like you're writing letters. Don't let your palm be too comfortable on the piece of paper. You really want to hold everything stiff with your arm and draw this from your shoulder blade over. So more of your body is working to do a long line. Maybe start here and do a light practice. When you've got that stroke down, just go ahead and do it, because there's really no mistakes when we're working in pencil here. Now, what's nice about doing a pure cube is that we can see squares in space. So if I told you that this is a square, you would say, no, it's not. It's a rectangle. Or if that's a square, no, that's a tall rectangle. But if I said, is that close? You go, yep, that's pretty good, because I can see a square in perspective. If I rotate around over here, it's not going to have this dimension, even though it's the same dimension, because of foreclosure on that, or shortening. And so there's our square on this side, which makes this the dominant one. And that is step 1 and step 2 of perspective. So I think it looks like it's more of a 3-dimensional volume popping off the page, so we don't need the box anymore. Now, the third point, which is really, for me, the most important part of sketching and drawing, is value. Because if I didn't have this light on here and I covered it all up, there's nothing to see on this paper. The image disappears without any light on it. Once you put light on it, the image is there. So now as the sketcher, the drawing person, we can articulate what we want to do in terms of importance in the sketch. And that really is, if I kind of use my hand as reference, this part of my hand is receiving light from the sun of my dock camera. The underside's not, so that darker skin is going to be different if I ever see the two together, the bright part of the skin, the darker skin. And then finally, the cast shadow is the darkest. It's almost like a black compared to the skin color. So let's assume that light is hitting this front side we want to make dominant. So we're going to keep that just white. And now on the side of the pencil, instead of doing the point, it'll be a little quicker if we just sort of wash a nice gray tone on one side of it, just to start. That helps it look in perspective too. They have that value added. Now the cast shadow comes from this side and actually throws an angle back. But then the top of this is parallel with the shadow. So the shadow will go back and actually vanish in perspective until the shadow then hits the back of the cube, and that comes down and stops the shadow and goes back around the corner. Then to highlight our person in white here, we can make our darkest tone yet at the base of the block or our residential house. And then what Wright would do is, he had this saying about architectural design, sometimes you can't get all sides perfect. He said that surgeons can bury their mistakes. Architects add nature. They add ivy, they add plants. So if a box is too mundane or there's like a backside that Wright didn't like, he needed landscape to kind of soften it up and use the power of the natural entity, because any singular tree Wright knew is better than any house he ever designed. He's just trying to get as close as possible to it. So using a perspective here, if we come over here and do a tree behind the house and assume it's like a residential where they did a lot of trees the same size, we can go on the top of that tree and vanish it, and the bottom, and then know that this tree is the same scale as that tree. We'll put one on this corner too, it'll come down to here. And then because it's dark green, that'll be darker than our building. This will be nice to edge that box, and so forth down the way, and then they'll diminish. And then typically in our sketches, because as things get further away, we see less value, we'll just sort of gray those out, so they're less important to us. And that's value. 1, 2, and 3 were done. Just to enhance this a bit, now I just sort of colorized and filled in, that's the same tone across, that's the same gray, that's white. What I want to do is enhance it and show that shade and shadow actually move across, and right where it's white, it's actually darker gray, right where it meets the white. Even though it's the same material there. And then where the tree comes down, it's going to cast a shadow itself, so the bottom of the tree is also a bit darker. And the tree on this side is a bit darker. And the other side of that. Maybe the ground plane there. And then to help sit this down, we'll simply pull out a horizontal line here and a horizontal line there. Maybe on this side, and so that might be the lot that it's on. And the lot might have a little bit of tall grass for that box. And having that ground plane there that really sits that box down on there. And so now I think what we've done is achieved what helps this idea of perspective, the illusion that this box might look to you to be brighter white than this part of the paper. And it's simply because it's surrounded by our values. And that's what's nice about the black Prismacolors, is that what I'd like you to get to, whatever media you choose, is that when you leave it white, that's just page white, that's the sun as bright as possible. So that's 0% value. But then you sort of wash it, and as you wash, you get darker and darker. The key thing about Prismacolor, it actually gets to black. And most pencils don't. If you use a soft 6B, it's kind of really dark gray, but then you can't get near it, it'll smudge like crazy. Whereas Prismacolor will move, but not as much as regular lead does. So that's why it's a great tool. To pay the extra $1 for Prismacolor really helps out. So we need to, in all your sketches this semester, go from 100% to black down to 0. So to make that an easy step into our sketch for today, we're doing this rhythmically in the chronological order. So that's why Unity Temple is first up. I think people, if they talked about his work, you talk more about the period before you start to talk about the Unity, but that's where we are now. So here is our view shed of the temple in 1905 and completed by 1908. So we're looking from the parking lot side, because the street side has got a lot of vegetation and changes over the years. This is actually a cleaner image of the site that we're going to draw it from. What's nice about it the building itself is cubic, so we're going to start with that language and get it correct, and then build all the other planes that'll fall off it to the left and right, north and south of the site. So we want to establish in all of our views, you can find great sensational drone pictures, you can find odd angles and stuff, but I really like to have them drawn as if you're on the site and you're walking up to it. So we want to be able to see this primary aspect facing east, the northern elevation less, that faces the town on the local road there. And then we're going to move from the primary space, so the ecclesiastical center, the spiritual part, down to the community center here, that's linked together by a little breezeway, much after the religious parody you see in Japanese temples over the years, when they take temples down and rebuild them every 20 years. This is a typical type of setting between the A and B by a C unit, a narthex that connects the two together. So what we're going to work on then, I'll come back to the model periodically as we go. I'll hold it up here in my left hand, is we simply want to find that horizon line. And so the tick marks kind of show you that if you came off of some of the horizontals I've articulated up here, you'll see that left vanishing point is coming off the page, and the right vanishing point, which is much closer to us, is driving down much quicker. So they're both off the page to the right and left on 1 by 17, but now the bottom where the parking lot ends is beneath the horizon line. So we know those two are going to come to a point, and these two are coming to the point, and they're going to be organized by somebody 6 feet tall with a camera on this site. So all the way across here, absolutely parallel with the top and bottom of the page, is the horizon line. So our first job is to grab the 5-fold openings here and drop that box down to ground and to its top, and the plane up above, which will protect that box in its day. And then the zones that we find on either side of this box, the pure cube, just like this was, we drew a second ago. And then when it comes to the corner of the plate that returns, and I've drawn that here, and then this one's going to turn, this is going to vanish back to the opposite point, which is on that horizon line. So somewhere between this line and that line, you're going to vanish that back. And then here, it'll be parallel to that, and then I'll come back to. We have a little bit of a bump out for the skylighting above the main space, which elongates the square into a rectangle. And we see one corner of that, but from this view, it dies back into this. We don't see it popping up beyond that. This comes down beneath the eye height of somebody standing next to it, and it's got a little bit of a base material that projects out as if it's got the feet of the cube being protected. And now that's going to rise from this corner back to this point off the page. So the reason why this is so sort of epic too is that it was almost a budget issue that made Wright become more creative than he naturally was in the prairie idea, because those wealthy people had a lot of money to spend on some opulent materials. Here was a congregation that they lost their building in a fire. And when they came back to build it, the budget, believe it or not, back in the day was $45,000, which is pretty modest. Even if you use that with inflation of what it would be today, you probably couldn't build this today. But Wright used what was probably the only material he could probably do to build it for the budget he wanted to. And that was that single aesthetic change, the modern movement of reinforced concrete. So a lot of people historically, at this type of scale, consider this to be the first modern building in the world. That's why it's on this UNESCO site, even though it's still spectacular, even if it wasn't the first, because it was innovating with the material of the 20th century. They still call it a modern building, even though it's really within this Art Nouveau realm, because they hadn't talked about modern architecture as an actual field of history. Because really the word modern is Tuesday at 4 o'clock, anytime in history, that's modern architecture with a small m. Modern with a capital M is actually a stylistic period in the 20th century. And Wright's part of that before it begins. Again, that great anomaly there. So we'll come down to the other wing here and find the same type of patterns there, where there's an initial movement of pieces that fly up and a return down the corner that comes over on the side. And some of the pieces that you might see in the distance as the cube completes itself are going to be out of our vantage point because we are so low compared to the height of the building. As I tilt this up, they fall out of view. Okay. So at this point, at the base of the cube here, coming from that left vanishing point, there's a piece that projects out, and it's the access point from the parking garage to that main court to a certain height, which is almost a little bit taller than eye height, and then comes back. So we'll run this piece back. And that'll be the base of the community center on the back side. And there are 4 zones for the openings for the community center back there, with its pop out on top. And that moves all the way across the site because this is a rectangle in plan. So it's got kitchen areas on one side and more congregation areas. And so it's breakout rooms for the children, for benefits, for things before and after the ceremonies. Okay, what we can do right away then is turn to some of the detail to show some of the massing. So each of these elements up top here are actually piers that rush up that height. So 6 piers given the 5 spaces. And then beyond them in terms of the depth, as they go back before they meet the wall behind them. So there is a little bit of almost like a porch that's made out of those elements there. And we'll double up that size as it floats over that porch. And much like the base here, there's a base of those piers that rise up. And they'll turn the corner briefly here as this does, as you see here by this column, to this point. And then this insets as a plane before this corner pier takes over. So coming about this height on either side, right across this whole element, there are 2 major piers that block down. So there's a square inscribed in a larger square. And so these piers will come out and then drop down to the corner. Now, as they run around, the images on the side reflect all 4 sides of this. It's broken up by the atrium that connects here, but it's meant to be in entirety as this thing's in the round, even though it's a square form. But the issue in terms of how it's nature is used is that on the street side, to buffer the sobriety of this reinforced wall, some of the writers in Chicago called it a Mayan courtyard when it was first built, because people didn't see reinforced concrete just as the actual decorative element itself. So what they did was they planted more of opulent trees on this edge. So this is what we'll use, a technique that Wright does for the languages architecture. We'll use that to frame the sketch and the drawing itself. So as the top of the square tower up top comes by and has its return, it's going to meet, instead of seeing the corner of the building, it's going to be met by the language of the architecture of nature herself. So we'll start with just some lines here, which is going to allow us to have the sketch move off the page in perspective, but blunt our eye. Because the only thing you don't want to do is have the end of a perspective come close to the edge of a piece of paper. So we're going to sort of waffle in, not as a subject, this is an idea of vegetation that'll come down to eye height so we can see beneath it, so we can see some ideas of the grade down below. But that'll be secondary information because it's around the corner. So this happens on this side, so we can simply carry this over at the same height and then run that line down. And then popping out from that corner, once we get around the pier here, are 5 openings. And they're going to be more compressed in terms of how we see them on the end of the building, rotating around, and a very large projection of a roof line that'll run that way too. On this side of the community, it's going to actually wrap around too, as the boxes keep enforcing the idea of a volume, repeating the volume adjacent to it. And then right on the corner, as you make your entry, whether from this side of the parking lot or the street on the other side, there's actually a nice detailed type of parapeted plant hanging where the planes then project off from that corner and create a vessel there to have vegetation on top of that and then setting down on the plinth of that corner pier. Okay, so now we're at a point where since the perspective of the boxes are kind of achieved, the next thing that's going to help us move through this is to move the pattern of light. And so that will be more from a photographic view rather than the model, because things get washed out very quickly by holding this here. So I'll keep it as a reference, but it's not going to match what the model is. It's going to match more of what it'd be if you were there on an early morning in the summer and the light's coming in from the east. So what we're going to do is make sure on the north side it doesn't receive light. We're going to come up to this whole zone up here, and we'll put its little band on the top. And we're going to make this whole edge of our skin in shade. So we're going to wash that over there to make sure we've kind of identified that as the principle of that being darker. And now this piece is going to come over a longer projection here and have that underside is darker. And now the whole north side gets a wash as well. Side of that, and then these two face north as well too. And the one side of this goes back is gray. And the edge above is grayed out. Now the fascia, which faces directly east, is brilliantly lit by the sun, but its underside, the projection of the eave, is a wash of dark. And now that comes down a certain distance on all of our piers here and then stops. So that'll be a cast shadow. It'll come back in maybe a little bit darker later. And then obviously the windows that are between these elements, here's the other side of all these piers. But the windows come down about halfway to light the congregational space on the inside, but not provide views out to anything in the area. So everything's happening down here in the lower 2/3. So there's no direct distraction like somebody's giving a sermon where you'd be looking outside. So it's a very controlled environment inside, almost you consider like a geode, a very crusty rock formation on the inside, but a beautiful sparkly space on the inside. Now here's the thing about windows is that we can wash all the stuff that's not receiving light, that's architecture. Windows people tend to think are going to be bright because they're lit up. But in the daytime, even with lights on, there's still a dark space. And that's what helped us kind of achieve that idea of it being dark by coming in and doing the darkest yet we've had to show that being inside away from the sunlight. So a darker volume. And then coming down from where the sun casts a shadow onto these piers, it'll come down an angle on all of its sides. So we can also make those a little bit darker as well. And so that kind of animates the top of that box and shows the frailty of light as it kind of moves across the space. So we'll come over here, and this is all in southern light, so that's a good exposure. This wall actually comes around, so we see one side of it. There's just a line break between construction there. The edge of our piece here doesn't have light on this side or the wall we're walking by. But then the wall does, at the angle the sun comes down, it does cast a shadow on that part of the building back over here. And then throws it a little bit as the sun is still early morning onto the base at this point. Now around this point, we've got all of this now, the community center back into this area, which is broken up by a couple of volumes. That's all in dark tone. So once you get past this wall, we simply wash that out. Make sure you keep the white of this entry planter nice and light. And the top rectangular volume that caps the community space also has nice value to it. So now, just like we did with the cube here, we've assigned value to these, and it seems like it clarifies the massing on the space here. We have to go back and repeat how these three piers create the 4 spaces for windows here by, first of all, articulating the pier themselves is a little broader. But then going between them and showing a little sliver of something much darker between those, which would be the interior of the space inside the community space. And that little bit will help kind of rectify that, of showing it as being inside, not outside space. Now, just like this projects the shadow cast on here, this projecting roof also comes down a certain distance on the community center. So we wash over there. This wall will keep nice and bright. And then again, to shield this white, like we're going to have this dark next to this darker dark here, we're going to come in and put one of the backyard on the lot trees kind of adjacent to it. Again, just the design of a generic tree next to it. Doesn't have to be a typology because it's not a subject. And we'll wash that as a tone right up to the edge of the white here, and then we'll pull that cube off the back. So now we can come back to the trees here, and they might be brighter at the top with the summer sun striking, but at the bottom they won't. So we'll put a dark here and run that right up to the edge of the building, and then beyond in the heights of the skies, beyond it. So those are all our steps that we sort of talked about so far. So as we kind of wrap this up, because we're getting close to 7 o'clock, now it's a matter of just going back and sort of enhancing what you've done so far, because really in terms of the scale and scope of this, we kind of just did a skeleton for it, then we washed it with tone, then we detailed a bit. We're going to do those exact same steps of detailing and more tone now, just to pull out more things that we want to express on the site. So one of the things we can do right away is to create that ground plane, which this has got a base to it. And so this part of the parking lot ends, and that's more of a walkway, so that helps out there. The language of this is just a flat plane with parking lines to it, which is very interesting, just adjacent to it, but it does have a tone to it. So I'd like to come up to this line and then start to bring a nice wash of tone that comes and has the white sit on top of it. So again, you're not doing the point of your pencil, you're kind of doing an oblong shape that gets chamfered off as you wash this back and forth, and have that come all the way over the right of the sketch. And then even to the point where near the base of the building, you want to have the lawn there be darker too, so it sits on a nice tight dark ground plane. So now we've got the weight of all this reinforced concrete kind of plunking down and then coming out perpendicular towards us. So maybe to help the line work, we'll come from the building and just do a couple of horizontal lines to go all the way back to that right vanishing point, which will help set this down as a horizontal plane. And then maybe come back in and wash to one point more heavy than the others, kind of nuance it a little bit. At this point, since it is more of a walkway, you could actually have concrete construction joints there to kind of give the way. And I think we've done enough in terms of placement of where our values are. There is a 5 or 6 story residential way behind it, but that's our prejudice. We can leave that out of the sketch here now because it wasn't there when Wright built this. So what we'll do now is just go back in and move ourselves toward that language of the black. So we've got all our white we want. It's really, the sun's doing a great job here. There's a little bit of a sliver of light for a window, vertical window that comes at the joints between the exploded square around the central square. That'd be nice to pick up. There is a detail here where this piece ends and then this butts out and comes down a little. So we could probably call out that one again to get the shape modulate more. And then we'll double up on this dark a little bit. You don't want to wash out all the white there because even though it's on a shade side, you want to have some highlights in the shade. So considering that, wherever planes in space meet, you go back into that edge, and you make it darkest right where they meet and then fan back. Darkest where it meets and kind of fan back. So that now that white's more prominent at the most important part of the sketch, which is right where the corner turns here and it goes on the north face. So it's got to be darkest right here where it's against the sky, even though it's a white piece. and it goes to white. Underneath, it's darker right at the edge by the sky, and then it can become a little bit lighter, and then maybe darker over here on this edge. Now we go to the window area, and I did sort of a dark gray there, but now we want to put jet black in there, but not in the same spot. We want to animate that and put some highlights of just splotches of dark that show that stained glass and light does different things and bounces around inside these windows. And that way it kind of intrigues us more in terms of looking at the detail of the space as we move back into it. Over on this piece, this is going to cut over to this edge of the house, or the community space, and then to the backyard where the vegetation is. And then right where that meets, we'll make that a darker edge to kind of end the building. It's got its trim piece at the base there, that'll go back. So we know that obviously this is our subject because that's the main ecclesiastical space. This is secondary, but we still want to sort of end that sketch there so the idea doesn't fall off the page. So this is a key corner because this ends the main building. And so we want to make that edge be prominent to get around this little short wall. We want to make that prominent. The underside of this, even though it's a cavity, it's not receiving any light. So that's actually fairly dark beneath the planting there. And that vegetation is going to be darker than the architecture. So we'll finish with that. Maybe turning the corner right going to the north on this plinth on the edge. Here that drives down to the ground could be more animated. The base of the tree, maybe as it kisses the building, you could define a couple more of the actual leaves on it to give some quality to that tree, because that's the only really subject tree that's that close to the building. So that might warrant a little bit of detail there. And we're getting close. And then maybe to have that one last sharpened pencil, I have this, there's a nice tip to it, kind of really give that nice edge at the top. Clean up that piece again. And now we are officially on our way to learning about Wright through these great international historical sites. So I will shortly close out the film and then post it to OneDrive later tonight or tomorrow morning. So you can do a repeat there for those who couldn't make it. They'll get the exact same information a day later. So I know you had a busy first couple of days here. If you've got questions, you can hang on and ask those, or else I'll see you in person next week. Make sure you start this week on Canvas with the 20-minute films that are lined up there. The names of them are in your syllabus, but they're also there waiting in Canvas. Pop those on. You can do them on your phone, but sometimes I'll use in color form. So you might want to get the color sooner. It's up to you. There's a whole array. I'll talk about that next week once you get started in terms of the level of quality, because there's a range of, you're working above the average in the class, what the average student does and what the below average student does in terms of equivocating. When my sketch is done in the film, how close can you get to that in terms of the rigor of the pencil point itself, articulating architecture? Instead of just sort of an outline and a couple of values kind of put in there like you did it, I can see whether you're engaging or not by sort of the quality of work you do as you sketch through those. So that's kind of the goal there. Really quickly, I could show you. Let's see. When you're done with your series of works, whether the big master works, so to speak, the hour-long ones in class or the 20-minute ones, the way you submit those to me at the end for review is you simply scan all the pages you drew on. Then you're going to extract that out, just like the ARC 100 book, and you're going to make a similar thing that's going to be called Wrightscape. And I can show you a demo of some past student work there. So, and again, 8.5 by 11 there, you'll come back in and simply talk about the panels you wrote about and say, why did I draw those? And so you remember this from the earlier class, but now it's all predicated on Wright. And so you can design it any way you like, but it's nice to write about it as well. And so I think there's a total of maybe 32, 33 films you look at in the course of the semester. And you can determine then your connection to this idea, because when you pick up that tool and use that on paper, you're actually following in the language of Wright as close as you possibly can. So you can never get that from just reading a textbook or listening to a PowerPoint. So you have to be an active learner here. So here was a CE student from Madison that eventually came, did his master's here in architecture. Actually went to Paris with us this past summer as well. There's another cover page. Here's some student that integrated some historic photographs as well. At the end, they kind of they can add their project imagery too for the stuff they're working on for the residents. But they're nice. You print one copy for me and drop it off if you can in person, or else mail it to me from Madison. And you print one for yourself. And it's kind of a nice archival piece for yourself of what you did for the semester. So Luke, your book's on the way, I hope. I mailed it off today.
Great, thank you very much.
But it is university mailing, so it's not going to be like anytime really soon, but hopefully before Friday for sure.
Absolutely, no worries at all.
Great. And then for the Madison people, just remember that I will send you a way to send me the $30. It's probably just by check or cash. The university can't, do Venmo, things like that just yet. And it was integrated in the tuition for UWM, so you just sort of owe us that the same amount they paid for the textbook. So we'll get that done too. So here we are, step one, 1905, Unity Temple, Frank Lloyd Wright. Have a good week, and I'll see you around school.
I had a quick question.
Sure.
I'm a Madison student.
Yeah.
But I'm not in Madison. I'm in Denver until middle of March or end of March.
Oh, okay.
So I can have, my first question is, how do I get the book? Should I have my friend grab it from the engineering?
Yeah, if you got somebody near the building, have them grab it and just mail it out to you. And then you'll have to look at the file of all these base drawings that have the little tick marks on them.
Yeah.
And if you're in Denver, just go to a Kinko's and print them out 11 by 17, then you're all set. And then you guys have to use that one code that the tech people did, the people in Madison, to access our canvas as a guest.
I'm on the canvas. I got that.
Okay.
Just to clarify, the book that I'm going to get sent to me, that doesn't have the tick marks. I have to print those out separately, right?
Print what out separately?
The pages with like the tick marks, like what you did.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the 11 by 17 is a different file. But so you're going to keep those 8 images outside the little tiny book, but you'll scan them and probably put them in there and show me anyway. But the book is going to be drawn by the canvas files.
Okay. Sounds good. So get the book and print out those other things.
Yeah. Once you see it, it's going to be very straightforward. We've been doing this for years and it works out pretty well for most everybody.
Okay. And then last thing, just to tell my friend, he just goes into the engineering building and asks, hey, I'm taking the Frank Lloyd Wright. I need to pick up my book.
Yeah, the front desk for the College of Engineering and Environmental Engineering. So it's not going to be on the first floor. I think it's like room 1429, something like that. So it's in the email. And then there's Sarah works there most of the time, and she knows about this, but she's told other staff members that a whole bunch of kids are going to pick up this book. And they're not going to charge you for it. They're just going to give it to whoever picks it up, and they can mail it to you.
Okay, sounds good. So there's also an email you send of instructions on how to pick it up.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Okay, you bet.
I had a quick question about like the homework for this class.
Yeah.
So we're doing it on a basic 8.5 by 11 paper. Is that the format?
Well, when you say homework, there's the project, and that'll probably be on, I'll have you guys use kind of a gridded printout. So you've got something to scale 1/8 inch. You can do it freehand, or you can do it by any kind of software you want, whatever you're familiar with. I think the best thing for residents is a lot of times just Chief Architect, but you can choose whatever you like, however you do your imagery. And that's kind of homework. The other homework is like what we did tonight, but it's already on Canvas. So you do it whenever you want, and that's putting the images in the textbook. And so when you're in the textbook, you'll find blank areas with little tick mark drawings in it that you're going to infill with the content.
Oh, okay. I totally misunderstood. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so you're drawing right into the book.
Okay, I thought we had to like get our own. Okay, that's
No, not separate. Make it right in there. So you're the illustrator of that textbook.
awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
So I have a question. I'm a Madison student.
Yeah.
How would I join the Canvas for this class?
So I sent that to you guys. If you want, I can resend it, but if you just look at the last 2 or 3 I sent you, there's one particularly for the Madison students where you guys, because it's not a statewide Canvas license, it's campus by campus. Don't ask me why, but it's difficult because you're going to come in as a guest and that'll log you into the Canvas because you right to go to this one course. And it's worked all the time, but it's a little cumbersome. You just can't all share the same license. But it's in that email. I've sent it a couple times now. So go to those 390, 790, 352 emails and read them all.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Yep.
I also have a quick question.
Yeah.
I got into the Zoom via a link sent to me through a classmate. I don't believe I got put onto the email chain because I checked a couple times and I couldn't find anything. Is it possible that I can be added onto that and like get the information
Yeah.
of, like the syllabus?
When
and
did you
all
join the class, Allison?
that? A couple weeks ago. So I mean, before, like way before classes started, but
Yeah, whenever I set up the email, which was I think orientation week,
mhm.
I looked at everybody enrolled in the class and I put them in that. If you would have been a day after that, then you really had to just contact me like you're doing now to add to that. So I'm going to have to add you manually because something's wrong in the system for a lot of classes now where they won't auto enroll to the email like it
Mhm.
typically do for a class email. That's not working this semester. So
I see.
I did it all by hand one day and then I'm doing one person at a time. So I'll put you on the list to add you in there.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
gonna say
sure.
because I enrolled in the class like I think like at the tail end of December. So
That's really weird because you would have not had the master list there. So I don't know.
okay.
Okay,
Right,
good. I'll
cool.
put you in. Yep.
And then I pick up the book. It's in the architecture building already, right? Did you say
Yeah.
295?
Yeah, right outside my office, there's a whole stack of them.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Have a good night.
You too.
Okay, I just have one final question.
Yep.
I printed off all of the things and I was kind of drawing along with you today on them.
Yep.
One of them was not in the same size as the other ones, and possibly I just went to an incompetent printer. So it's absolutely
out
huge.
at 8.5 by
Um,
11 or something.
It's yeah. Is it
Well-
okay to use that size, or should I like resend it to like a Kinko's or something and ask them, just let them know one of these isn't the right size, please put it to the right size?
Yeah, I would. It's an 11 by 17 file that's PDF, all laid over in the same PDF. So I don't know why it would pick out one. That just seems like it was a blip. You should be able to. Are you at UWM or UW?
I'm a UW student, but I live in Edgerton, so I just used our local printer and like sent them the file.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're gonna like them better at 11 by 17 because then when you shrink them down, they look terrific. Because you get more detail in the areas there. So what you can do is next time you do, don't print all 8 again. Just open up the file and print it and select custom pages, just page 6 or whatever the one you're missing.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, good.
Great, thanks.
All right, thank you.